Hi everyone, I'm Jenny. I'm the TA for the course Climate Action. I'm here with Bill McKibben, who is an environmental justice activist, author, and journalist. He's the leader of the climate justice campaign group 350, which has sparked a movement to end fossil fuels and build 100% renewables, notably through the fossil fuel divestment campaign, which in less than 5 years has won over 1,000 commitments worth $8.5 trillion in institutional funds that are no longer invested in fossil fuels. So thank you so much for joining us, Bill.
Well, Jenny, what a pleasure to be with you today.
Great. So thank you again for joining us. Can you give a little bit of a background to talk about how you got into activism?
I sure can. I'm not an activist by background or training or anything else. I'm a writer. That's how I came up in the world, a writer and a journalist. And when I was in my mid-20s, which would have been in the mid-1980s, long before you were born, I wrote the first book about climate change, a book called The End of Nature, which was a successful book. It was published in 24 languages and things, and it laid out what at the time was the abstract threat of climate change. We knew what was coming, but we didn't know quite how fast and quite how hard it would hit. Because I'm a writer and an academic, I tended to think of the world as an argument. My theory was that if we wrote enough books and had enough symposiums and had enough webinars and wrote enough journal articles, that eventually the powers that be would do the things that were clearly required. Science had given a unambiguous and loud warning that the most dangerous thing in the world was about to happen. Surely we would do something. It took me quite a while, 15 years, to be able to figure out that my analysis wasn't quite right. We were winning the argument about climate change. The science was very clear, but we were losing the fight about climate change because the fight was about money and power. And most of that money and most of that power lay with the fossil fuel industry, the richest industry in the world. And so at a certain point, it became clear to me that we needed to try and build some power of our own. We were obviously never going to have as much money as Exxon. So the only alternative that history suggested was to try and build big mass movements of people that might be able to stand up to that power. And so that's what we've spent much of the last almost 15 years engaged in. 350.org was the first attempt at a global grassroots climate campaign. It began very simply with myself and 7 undergraduates at the small college in rural Vermont where I teach. We set out to organize the world. There were 7 undergraduates. There are 7 continents. Each one of them took one. The guy who took the Antarctic also was responsible for the internet. It didn't seem like a very auspicious beginning. And yet, I think because there was a kind of unfilled ecological niche, we were more successful than we had any real right to be. Within a year or so, we coordinated the first big global climate protest, 5,200 simultaneous rallies in 181 countries. We've gone on to do that same kind of work for many years. We think we've organized about 20,000 demonstrations in every country on Earth except North Korea. But within a few years, it became clear that the basically educational nature of that work, raising awareness around climate change, was not going to move the needle fast enough, that the pace of change was being, necessary change was being dictated by physics, and that meant we had to move very fast. So we evolved from just kind of education to confrontation as well. 7 years ago, I guess, almost 8 now, started the fight against the Keystone Pipeline in the United States, which became the kind of archetype for other fights all over the world now about fossil fuel infrastructure. So people standing up to pipelines, to coal mines, to fracking wells, to new coal terminals and the coasts, to on and on and on. Some of these fights we've won. Keystone, for instance, still isn't built. Some of them we've lost. In every case, we've cost the oil industry time and money and slowed them down. And slowing them down is extremely important, because as we slow them down, the engineers are doing their job. The cost of solar and wind power drops now every month. And so every bit of fossil fuel infrastructure we can delay is fossil fuel infrastructure that will eventually not be built because there'll be a cheaper alternative. At the same time, we went after the, as you mentioned in your introduction, we went after the financial heart of the industry too, with a very widespread campaign of fossil fuel divestment, getting people to sell their stock holdings in these companies whose business plan calls for burning far more carbon than scientists say we can safely burn. And that's been successful beyond our wildest imaginings. It was modeled on a campaign 30, 35 years ago when the opponent was apartheid in South Africa. But this has grown much bigger even than that. We've persuaded colleges, universities, religious denominations, giant insurance companies, huge pension funds to divest from fossil fuel. Within the last year or so, New York City has divested its massive pension fund, the same with London and Paris. The entire nation of Ireland last August divested all its public holdings from fossil fuels. In November, the biggest pool of investment capital on earth, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, announced that it was divesting $1 trillion from companies that explore for oil and gas. So we're making progress. The question is whether that progress is fast enough, and the answer is I think not. We're still behind in this climate fight. We still need far more people involved, which is why it's so beautiful to watch over the last months the emergence of big new fronts in this movement. The school strikes pioneered by Greta Thunberg in Sweden that have now spread across the continents. The Green New Deal here in the United States, first codified by your New York City colleague, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but now national and even international in its appeal. So there are good signs of things happening. We just need them to happen much faster because the scientists have made it clear. The scientists have made it clear that we have just a very short time to get ourselves off coal and gas and oil. I'll stop there and questions.
Hi, sorry, Bill. I think the connection got cut out for a second.
Okay.
Okay. I think I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. So when it got cut out, you were talking about the great advances that have been taking place, led by young people around the world, and how exciting it is and humbling it is to watch people take control of the power that is theirs.
That's correct. It's been a good year to watch the school strikes that Greta Thunberg started in Sweden spread across the continents, and it's been a good year to watch the Green New Deal activism from the Sunrise Movement and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez come to really kind of dominate U.S. politics.
Right. So this is a question that we got from one of our learners in this course. So there are many grassroots movements around the world that are fighting for climate justice. Like you mentioned, people who are blockading oil and gas infrastructure, like at Standing Rock, to the Yellow Vests in France, to the student strikes for climate justice just 2 weeks ago. These people are fighting to preserve biodiversity, promoting recycling and conscious consumption more generally. And yet we're still nowhere near where we need to be to meet our Paris Agreement targets. And those Paris Agreement targets are not enough to keep temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. In fact, in the US, we're moving backwards because of political cowardice, despite overwhelming grassroots support and scientific evidence. If politicians aren't listening, what difference can grassroots activism make? Is a grassroots movement really going to change anything?
Well, we don't know if the grassroots movement will win in time or not, but it's pretty clear that if we don't have one, we don't have any chance. Look, left to their own devices, the powers that be will respond to the wealth of the fossil fuel industry. That's as clear as the nose on my face. That means that if we want to change that, we need to build big movements. We've got a good movement for climate justice, but it needs to be bigger by an order of magnitude than it is. And that's capable of happening. Look at the speed with which suddenly hundreds of thousands of students learned about climate strikes and were walking out of their schools. Now imagine that starting to happen with adults too, disrupting not education as usual, but business as usual. We need enormous pressure. And of course, part of that needs to be on the political system. It's a good sign that all the major candidates, Democratic candidates for president, have endorsed the Green New Deal, because that means if we can get one of them elected, we can hold them to that promise, or at least try to.
Right. So there are those people who talk about divestment, and I guess critics might say that fossil fuel companies, given that they have a lot of resources, they ought to play a main role in the energy transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. And therefore, it's important to stay invested and to take a shareholder activist role instead. How do you respond to this critique of divestment?
Well, it's a good critique in theory, but in practice turns out not to be true. The biggest organizers around shareholder engagement in this country are a group called Some of Us. And they put out a report last fall saying that while shareholder activism, which is their main tactic, works very well in most cases, it's done nothing in the fossil fuel industry and on climate. And the reason, I think, is that if you're an oil company, it's not like climate change is some, that there's some like small flaw in your business plan that you can fix. Shareholder activism works well, say, if Apple Computers is paying slave wages to Chinese workers. So then we put some pressure on them and they raise the wages of the Chinese workers and the price of an iPhone goes up a few dollars, and that's progress. The problem in this case is that there's not some small flaw in the business plan of Exxon. The business plan itself is the flaw. All they know how to do is dig up more stuff and burn it, pouring carbon into the atmosphere in the process. And so I think the idea that these companies are going to lead the transition is probably incorrect. The history of technology indicates that it was not the people who were good at making buggies to be pulled behind horses that ended up dominating the car industry. It wasn't the newspapers and television companies that ended up dominating the internet. It's very difficult for those incumbent technologies to make change in time. What we really need to do with the fossil fuel industry is get them out of the way, break their political power if we can.
Right, and divestment is a strategy that makes this into the moral issue that it should be.
That's correct. One of the good things about divestment is not everybody has an oil well planned for their backyard. Not everybody has a pipeline going through the middle of their town. But most people, if they're at a university, if they belong to a church, if they have a pension fund, they're connected in some way to one of these pots of money that's now supporting the fossil fuel industry and instead could be supporting the transition. And the good news is that though the moral case is fundamental, you don't even really have to be very moral at this point to want to divest, because the fossil fuel industry is losing lots of money. It's underperformed the rest of the economy for the last 5 or 10 years because it has such a serious challenge coming from, there's a better technology out there. Sun and wind are providing energy for less money than fossil fuel. So people who took the advice to divest early on made lots of money in the process too. They were both, they really did have their cake and eat it too in this case.
Right. So can you discuss in what ways the divestment movement is achieving its goals, and perhaps talk about what comes after divestment?
Sure. There were two, we had one goal originally when we started the divestment campaign, and that was to take away the kind of social license of these companies, to use it as a way to explain that what they were doing was scientifically hideous. And that's been effective. The academic research shows that it was the most effective campaign in helping people change their minds about this industry. We didn't really think we were going to get big enough, fast enough to have a big financial impact on them. But it turns out that we have. There was actually last week a really interesting story in Politico, the political magazine in the United States, that interviewed a bunch of the executives of coal companies. And they were saying they no longer could really raise money for new coal mines, new coal, because divestment had so reduced the number of investors who were willing or able to engage with them. So it's having quite a practical effect as well. Hello? Yes, can you hear me now again?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
I was saying that not only had divestment taken a moral toll, it had also taken a financial toll on these industries. And there was a good story last week where a bunch of coal executives were complaining that they could no longer raise money for new mines and things because divestment had so reduced the pool of potential investors that they were out of capital. So happily, people's actions are having both a very powerful symbolic effect and a very powerful practical effect. And I'm very grateful to everybody out there who's helped with this divestment campaign, because it's taken millions of volunteers around the world.
So we have a few questions from the audience, if you can address them.
Yeah.
The first is, what are some success stories that help you stay positive doing this work? Is there a country, state, or city that is doing a good job at a transition?
Yes, that's a very good question. And there are success stories that help me stay positive. You can look at countries, some of them are obvious, the Scandinavian countries and things. Some of them may be less obvious, places like Costa Rica that essentially run now entirely on renewable power. So there are now a number of cities that have made that commitment and either gotten close or are running on entirely renewable energy. And all those things are very hopeful. What's also hopeful, Jenny, is watching as there's still more than 1 billion people on Earth who have no access to electricity. And watching now those people begin to get that access and having it come through clean, renewable energy is really beautiful to watch. I was in Ghana, the Ivory Coast, and Tanzania doing a story for the New Yorker not long ago about the rapid spread of renewable electricity to rural parts of Africa, places that would never get grid power, or at least not get it for another 50, 60, 70, 100 years. But the price of a solar panel is now so cheap that people are getting their first power, and it's clean power. It's sort of the same way that people leapfrogged landline telephones directly to mobile phones. They're now doing the same thing. So the newest technologies in the world are being deployed in some of the most remote places on Earth, and that's very, very beautiful to see.
So just going off of that, how do we ensure climate justice and the just transition happens everywhere in the world so that no one gets left behind? Because there's the argument that in order to get energy justice, for example, is what they call it sometimes, in order for everyone to have access to electricity, it's unrealistic to not invest in gas infrastructure.
Yeah, well, at this point, that's just, I mean, people thought that 5, 10, 15 years ago, but at this point, it's clear that the UN just issued a report saying that 90% of new hookups, first-time hookups to electricity, are going to come from renewable energy, just because it's incredibly cheaper. Think about it. You can put a little solar microgrid in a village, and people have power overnight. You don't have to build big centralized power station. You don't have to build a network of power poles, you know, going out across the countryside. These are all things that African countries or parts of Asia or things can't afford, and instead they're getting good power cheap from renewable energy. So in a larger sense, the most important step to take toward climate justice is to make sure that we slow down the pace at which the planet is heating. Because the iron law of climate change is the less you caused it, the more you suffer from it. And if we aren't able to slow down climate change rapidly, the biggest victims will be in the poorest places in the world who have the least margin to deal with what's coming at them.
Right, exactly. And according to recent research, in order to have a chance of keeping planetary warming below 1.5 degrees, something like 85% of known fossil fuel reserves need to stay in the ground.
And the good news is we know how to do that in a way that we didn't 10 years ago. The price of a solar panel has fallen 90% in the last decade. We used to know that we couldn't burn coal and gas and oil, but we didn't know what would replace them. Now we know what could replace them if only we could get the political power of the fossil fuel industry out of the way.
All right. So the next question is related to SDG 5, which is on gender equality. In this course, we see that gender equality is not always included in climate change actions. Let's say that the demands of climate justice activists have been met, and we're on a course to getting the whole world on 100% renewable energy. How do we make sure that things like gender equality and other forms of inequality and discrimination do not happen when planning for climate action? So
well, the only way to make sure is to fight for them. But it's very clear that the effects of climate change fall most heavily on women and girls because they're usually the most vulnerable in any population. And B, it's clear that an energy transition benefits them most. Most places around the world, the people who have to spend 4 hours a day out scavenging sticks to make a fire to cook for the evening are women and girls. And they're the people whose lives are most transformed when there's a solar panel on the roof, when there's a high efficiency cook stove in the house. But the only, I mean, there's no secret answer here. The only way to ever ensure justice is to keep fighting for it at all times. That's what social movements are about.
All right. Okay, so we have another question from the audience. You mentioned that scientists have been sounding the alarm about climate change since the 1980s. What roles could scientists play in bridging the gap between scientific research and public policy?
Scientists are playing an increasingly active role now, I think. For a long time, scientists thought that their job was just to go do the science and tell the rest of us, and our job, everybody else's job, was to act on it. And that's a rational, reasonable way to think about the world, and probably how the world should work, but it's not how the world does work. You have to keep pushing and prodding, and scientists, because they have special credibility, are very effective pushers and prodders here. It was very good news, for instance, last year, 2 years ago, when there was a major march of scientists in Washington to demand action on climate change. And we need to see much more of that kind of thing. We also need to see things like the scientific reports that come out, managing to communicate more effectively with people. And we've seen some progress here. When the IPCC reported in the fall about the 1.5 degree target, they were able to do so in language that communicated the urgency that scientists feel. They made it clear we only had a few years, a dozen years, to make real progress on this. And that was very helpful in making people understand the situation. Sometimes scientists have a hard time speaking as plainly as you need to be able to speak to be understood in this world. And that's why it's good that scientists are working hard to figure out how to communicate more effectively.
Thank you. So we have another question from the audience. It's okay. I'll just ask the questions because yeah. All right. So suppose there is a risk-free opportunity to increase the chances of passing a carbon tax or cap and dividend legislation. So suppose it took the form of a conditional pledge. You pledge between $500 and $10,000, putting 10% down to be a pledge person. Funds would then be used as an offset fund for coal communities. So if legislation passes, you pay your pledge, and if it fails, you pay nothing and your money gets refunded.
Kind of approach to things, yeah.
Yeah, so what they're saying is the more you pay, the more likely it is that the legislation passes. So in summary, why aren't we taking collective financial action to address climate change? Like, is it possible to form some kind of fund way to fund the just transition, basically through collective action outside of policy?
Well, I mean, it's my guess is that it's going to be hard to have a Kickstarter large enough to do what we need to be doing. And really, it's not the task of, I mean, this is the task that governments should be doing. Governments are just all of us together. But the questioner recognizes, I guess, that that our governments don't work very effectively because they're so overpowered by the fossil fuel industry. One way around this may be doing what many jurisdictions are now doing, which is suing the fossil fuel industry in court. Look, you know, these companies made record profits for decades precisely because they were ignoring all the impacts that they were having on the world around them. They should be held accountable to pay for that and to pay for the transition away from their product to a clean and healthy product. And there's a lot of that happening. You know, New York City, among others, is busily suing the oil majors, and that's, I think, a good sign. My guess is we're not going to solve this problem with a Kickstarter or a GoFundMe page, but you never know. Stranger things have happened, and I'm happy to kick in if one gets going.
Great, thank you for answering that. So I guess we'll move on to the 1.5 degree report. So the IPCC report said that in order to keep planetary warming below 1.5 degrees, as a world, we have to get to net zero by around 2050, hopefully before then. But after that, it's also important to take carbon dioxide out of the air in order to stabilize temperatures. Can you discuss how this can be done sustainably, for example, through reforesting deforested forests,
Yep.
Agriculture, or land use changes?
So forestation is truly important, and we should be, I mean, the first job is to stop ongoing deforestation, because that's the easiest and most effective. But yes, then replanting areas that have been denuded of trees is crucial. But so are other land use changes, as you indicate. We have to begin farming with soil in mind and trying to increase the carbon content of that soil. And it's entirely possible. In 2015, at the Paris talks, the French government announced a plan to increase annually the amount of carbon in the soils of its farms and to pay farmers to make that happen. And so if you want to read more about it, Google the 4 per 1,000 plan, which is what they called it. And it's been at least somewhat successful so far. We need those same kind of soil and land use changes going on around the world, and there are good programs. I don't know, to be frank, whether one can scale them quickly enough or not. There are more than 1 billion farmers on planet Earth. It's difficult to change the ways that they practice their livelihood, very quickly. But people, thank heaven, are trying now, and there'll be at least some big changes, I think, in the years ahead.
All right. And of course, other forms of carbon capture might rely on biofuels, which then the land use competes with agricultural uses, right?
Yeah, biofuel seems not to be one of the things that's going to be a key part, I think, of the.
Yeah, at the very least, it can only be carbon neutral if it's used as a fuel.
Yes.
So we have another question from the audience. What is the role of fossil fuel subsidies in all this? If we remove them, would that be enough? How far might that take us?
It would definitely help. It wouldn't be enough, but it's one of the 5 or 10 things that we should do. And it's absolutely the easiest thing to do of all. Like, why are we doing it? We're just giving present every year to the richest industry on the planet. Just because they have a lot of political power, they use that political power to force governments to give them gifts. It's absurd. I mean, what's logical and obvious is that, in fact, they should be paying huge amounts of money to the rest of us for the damages that they've caused. But at least not just handing them over big stacks of cash would be a good way to start. And that's why we've worked hard, and others have worked hard, to try and end fossil fuel subsidies. Sadly, in the United States, at least now, that's hard. Donald Trump is doing every possible thing he can to help these guys.
Right, exactly. It's super difficult when I think in G20 countries, they spend 4 times as much money subsidizing fossil fuels as they do for renewables.
Yeah.
So definitely, it's a reason why things are the way they are today.
It's exactly right.
Right.
Cause and effect.
Yeah. And that all of, everyone's fates are tied into this if their pension is also invested in the future of fossil fuels.
The way to deal with these things, if you want to deal with them, is to join movements. Together, individually, we really are not able to challenge climate change. There's nothing you can do as an individual that really matters. My house is covered with solar panels. I'm proud of that, but I don't try to fool myself into thinking that that's how we're going to beat climate change. You can't make the math work one house at a time anymore. We have to become a little less individual and join together in movements large enough to matter. That's why we started 350.org. That's why Sunrise Movement for young people, or the school strike movement. There are movements out there that are making progress. We just need you in them.
Right. So let's talk a bit about the Green New Deal. You mentioned Sunrise, who have been gaining a lot of momentum for getting support for this. Can you discuss what is it and how do we make it happen, not just in the US, but also around the world?
Sure. So the Green New Deal, the important thing to know about it is, I think, because it's not completely fleshed out yet. People are spending this year doing the work to kind of draw up all the particulars of the plan. But what's important about it is that it's the first attempt to address the problem of climate change with measures that are on the same scale as the problem, that are as big as the problem is. So, for instance, in the US, it envisions getting us entirely off fossil fuels for electricity generation by 2030. That would be a very hard task. It was one of the reasons that the Green New Deal also includes a federal job guarantee, so that anybody who wanted to help in this work would have a job doing it if they wanted to, because we're going to need a lot of people to make it happen. This idea, in many different forms, is, as you say, spreading around the world. And it's crucial that it do so, because no country can solve climate change on its own, obviously. It's the first really global problem that we've had. But I think that the most important thing about it is just that sense of scale. And remember, it harkens back to the original New Deal. The original New Deal was an attempt to deal with what we call the Great Depression, the biggest economic upheaval in human history. And it required not a little tinkering around the edges here and there. It required huge change. Franklin Delano Roosevelt made sure that there were jobs for everybody who wanted or needed one, through his various works programs, for instance. And that was the reason that we were able to pull ourselves out of the Great Depression. So this is, climate change is the biggest problem, bar none, that humans have ever faced. It makes sense that it requires a big solution like this.
Right. And so a lot of critics of the Green New Deal, they ask, how will we pay for it? So I'm going to ask you that. How will people pay for it? You mentioned, for example, lawsuits that are
That'll help.
taking, yeah.
That'll help. Those kind of things will help. But so there's a couple of ways to answer this. The first is to point out that if we don't do it, we're going to have to pay far more money, because the cost of climate change is larger than any price tag anyone's ever paid for anything. I mean, 10 years ago, the economist Nicholas Stern in the UK estimated that climate change would cost more than World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression combined. And then 5 years ago, he said he'd severely underestimated how big the costs would be. So we can't afford not to do this. It will take money, but that money is financially sound, because think about it. Once you've spent the money to replace a fossil fuel plant with say a solar farm, okay, it takes money to build both of them. The difference is, once you've built the solar farm, the energy comes for free. The sun just rises and shines, And so people will end up over time spending a lot less money than they do now, because wind and sun are much cheaper than coal and oil and gas. So that's the reason to think that this will actually be a boost to prosperity over the long run.
So going back to divestment, can you talk about what comes after divestment? Like after people have convinced their university or their pension fund to not be invested in fossil fuels.
Well, one good thing would be to convince them to reinvest at least some of that money in renewable energy and in this transition to green energy. And that's happening in a lot of places. There's a very good group called Divest Invest that makes that their whole focus, and people should know about them and engaged with them, because there's money to be made and good to be done in that transition.
Right. So, but do you think that by reinvesting in renewable energy, that is enough to change policy at a global scale?
No, I don't think. We keep asking these sort of questions about, is this thing enough? Is that thing enough? None of these things are enough. We have to do all of them and more. This is the hardest task humans have ever undertaken. So the idea that just finding one magic thing to do it is incorrect. We're going to have to do an awful lot of things.
Right. And we have to find the cracks in the system, and that's how
very nicely
will
put.
Change. Yeah.
Very nicely put. Places where we can exert leverage.
Right. So there's been a lot of talk recently about how climate change is going to get worse, and a lot of people are afraid. Do you think this despair is justified, or do you think it should be spent feeling something else?
I think it's highly justified. You know, I mean, look, at the end, I'm a writer, so I think it's important to be super honest with people. But I also think that people's fear that if you're honest, it will depress people, turn them off, keep them from acting is wrong. We've always found that people are more likely to act when they think that they're being dealt with honestly. You know, when we started 350.org, the name comes from what the scientists say is the most carbon you could safely have in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million. We were already above that when we started 350.org. So in some ways, it was a very depressing number. People said, oh, people be... I didn't think so. I thought it was like when you go to the doctor. You want the doctor to be honest with you. You want him to say, your cholesterol is too high, if it's too high, because then you can do something about it. And that's kind of the situation that we're in. We need people understanding that this is not some problem for the future. This is the biggest problem facing us right now.
Right. It's the biggest problem facing us right now. But if we all work together to address it head on, then no matter what, we will have made a better world. And that's what counts.
That's true. It should be said, to be honest, that we don't know at this point how much of the damage we can still avert, because we've gone, you know, there's a lot of momentum. Once things start to happen, like the polar ice sheets start to melt, then it's difficult to reverse any of that damage. So I don't want to be glib. I do want to be honest, and honest answer is we're very hopeful that we can still head off the absolute worst effects of climate change. But that's a narrow window, and it is closing. So if people want to act on this, they need to act urgently on it. It's the first timed test that humans have had. All our other problems, if you don't deal with them now, you can go back and deal with them 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But this one, you can't. If you don't deal with it now, you'll never deal with it.
Right. But dealing with it now, it makes the world a lot more prepared in the future.
Exactly right. All the things that we need to do are smart things to do in and of themselves. And, you know, for so many reasons. I mean, there was a story today that said, forget about climate change. Air pollution tied to fossil fuels kills 4 million people a year around the world. Even if climate change didn't exist, that would be more than reason enough to be putting up solar panels and wind turbines. You know, having spent a lot of time in Delhi and Beijing and places, I can tell you it's no fun to be a human being trying to survive in places that choked with smog.
Right, exactly. So just, and most of the solutions that we will rely on in the future will have to run on renewable energy anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah. So how do you think that the world will be able to get to net zero by 2050? Like, let's say it's 2050 and the world has gotten to net zero. What do you think happened to get us there?
I think the only thing that can happen to get us, I mean, let's assume that the engineers keep doing their job and making solar and wind cheaper and cheaper. And I think that's a safe assumption. Engineers are good at what they do. The rest of it is up to us. Can we build movements big enough to challenge the power of the fossil fuel industry? Because left to their own devices, they'll keep us from changing fast enough. So that's what it's going to take. And it's going to take people, you know, I've been to jail now a bunch of times. Not everybody's going to have to go to jail, but there's going to have to be people who are willing to. Not everyone's going to have to march, but actually, probably everybody is going to have to march. Everyone's going to have to do things that are outside of their comfort zone because the planet is outside its comfort zone.
So once those movements have been built, what kinds of policies do you see being enacted? Do you feel that this is something that can be achieved through decentralized energy, for example, or will it take more than just electrifying everything?
I think that that's probably the single most important thing. There's obviously 1,000 things that have to happen because there's 1,000 parts of this. There are big contributions to climate change from agriculture, from cement, from transportation, on and on and on. But the most crucial central challenge is to electrify as much of our power system as we can and then to generate that electricity with renewable energy. And if we do that, we will break the back of this problem and give us some room to work on the harder parts. Like, how on earth are you ever going to fly people on an airplane that, you know, doesn't rely on fuels and things? I don't know. And maybe the answer is we should fly a lot less than we fly now. But I do know that that's still only 3% of you know, emissions. The key is getting control of the 60 or 70% of emissions that we should be able to get to by electrifying things and making that electricity renewable.
Right, because something like 70% of all emissions come from fossil fuels.
Correct.
Yeah, and historically, or since the 80s, it comes from 100 fossil fuel companies.
That's correct.
Right. So we have another question from the audience. This question is about Shale Sky Plan. So what about Shale Sky Plan, which was part of this course? Does that show movement with one fossil fuel company? Rather than painting all fossil fuel companies with one brush, is there an option to divide and conquer? So just to comment on that, Shale Sky Plan, they call it the most ambitious plan to decarbonize energy, but its aim is to reach net zero by 2070.
Yeah. Look, the goal of the fossil fuel industry is to spread out this transition as long as possible so that it does the least economic damage to the fossil fuel industry. The goal of the rest of us should be to speed up this transition as much as possible so we do the least damage to the planet that we can do. Shell is talking about investing some small percentage of its research and development and exploration budget in renewable energy. That's good, but it's still dwarfed by, I mean, they're still out there looking for new fossil fuel deposits, even though we already have in our reserves 5 times what any scientist thinks we can burn. So I'm unwilling to let Shell off the hook. The fact that they may be a little better than Exxon is, they're still a big part of the problem.
Right. The Rainforest Action Network recently published a report about how banks are still funding climate change, basically, and how in 3 years they've funneled in $1.6 trillion into fossil fuel exploration in a time when they shouldn't be doing that. Like maybe if they spent that much money on renewables, this would be a completely different story today. But unfortunately, the rules aren't favoring those consequences right now. So I guess we'll go back to this question. So rather than painting all fossil fuel companies with one brush, is there an option to divide and conquer? So I guess my interpretation of this question is it possible to like make it so that to, I guess, incentivize a fossil fuel company to liquidate all of its fossil fuel assets and become 100% renewable?
Well, it might be. I mean, you could imagine, say, Statoil, the Norwegian oil company, heading in that direction. But I don't think that that's the main task. You know, much of this would have been different 20 years ago if we'd put a serious price on carbon. And that would have incentivized all sorts of people to be moving quickly in the right direction. At this point, my guess is that the fossil fuel industry comes to this party too late and isn't going to be playing a huge role in this transition. That there are others who are now better at doing solar power and wind power and so on. And that the main job of the fossil fuel industry is to get the hell out of the way. But perhaps there'll be some companies that prove the exception to the rule, and that'll be fine.
Right. So we have another question from the audience. Could we work with coal companies, for example, that are likely to be most impacted in the short run by a carbon tax? So I guess this question is it possible to, or how do we work with coal communities as they transition?
And we should. There should be
or coal companies,
money
right,
for just transition, and there has been in every bill that, say, in the U.S. Democrats have put forward. But the coal companies have blocked all that because they want to hold workers hostage so they can keep trying to do what they're doing. There's not a coal company on earth that's been the slightest help in this transition, and there won't be, I don't think. The coal industry is now, I think we've managed to, in many ways, break their political power and separate them from the oil and gas companies. And now it's time to do the same with the oil and gas companies.
Right, exactly. And it's been through the work of activists and organizations working together to challenge commonly accepted beliefs.
Yep, absolutely.
Right. And I guess to also comment on this question, in Spain, they have passed, I think it's called a Just Transition Bill, to do just that, to help coal communities transition out of out of this dynamic.
Coal miners left in the world, so it should be within our means to make sure that they don't have to suffer for something that's no fault of their own.
Right. And hopefully in the future, all of our hard work will eventually result in some good changes.
You said it.
So, right. So, are you hopeful for the future?
I don't spend a lot of time worrying about whether I'm hopeful or not hopeful, optimistic, pessimistic. I just get up in the morning and do what I can do to push the pace at which we're changing. If we do all we can, we'll find out if it was enough. That's, I think that's where we are.
Yeah, and no matter what, the future that we're building for is for each other. And
I'm very hopeful about the fact that we have movements of people who care about each other, work with each other, are building and trying to build better communities. And I'll do everything I can to make sure that it happens fast enough. If there are days when I despair, it's because I think it's not happening fast enough. But that's just incentive to work that much harder.
All right. So our last question, it's another question from the audience. They're asking you to comment in Asia, where India and China are still building coal power plants. So I guess the final question will be, how do we make sure that countries that aren't like developed countries, how will they transition with the rest of the world?
I mean, this is a good place to end, because we can be somewhat optimistic. Yeah. India and China are doing better than the U.S. and much of the rest of the world. I mean, China's putting up renewable energy at a pace no one's ever seen before. And in India, I was just looking at the figures the other day for a story I was writing. Solar power in particular has gotten so cheap that last year, something like 40 times more renewable energy went up than new coal plant power went up. I mean, it's starting to happen very fast. It's not happening fast enough because the coal industry retains enormous political power, lots of workers, the banks have lent it lots of money. But man, you can generate an electron in India with the sun far more cheaply than you can do it with coal. So it gives us room to push, and that's what we should be doing. And I just want to thank everybody who's doing that pushing all over the world. And Jenny, I want to thank you for this excellent interview. I really enjoyed it.
Great. Thank you as well, Bill.
Right.
We do have one more question. It's about if it is possible to have a tool to run solutions without depending on politicians. Is it possible to just build community power, or will this take
not fast
government
enough
support?
Governments are but governments are us, you know, to some degree or another. So we've got to use that tool too. And I you know, if we had an infinite amount of time, then we can do lots of things, but we have not much time. So we got to work with all the institutions that we have, and we have to, when they're bad, we have to toss out those politicians and get in the new ones.
Right. But what we need is to try every avenue we have for
every avenue.
Tactics. Yeah.
I have to go, Jenny. Many, many thanks for your good work, and I'll look forward to more conversations.
Right. Thank you so much, Bill, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you to all who are watching this, and hope we all win.